Father, I just thank you for the opportunity that we have to come together, to hear from your word, to be reminded of what you are doing in the world, to be reminded of the way that you wish for us to participate in your kingdom coming here on earth. I pray that the words that I say would be pleasing to you, and that you would use them to speak to people who are here. Thank you for who you are, and I pray that you would be present with us today. Amen. So I guess I'm just going to start with a little bit of background about me. Ian shared a little bit already, but I guess one thing for me is that mission has kind of always been a bit of a part of my life, whether it's been here in New Zealand or whether it's been overseas. And it was probably, it took a while to realise that that's what it was. But I grew up in South Auckland, and from the time that I was about 14 or 15, I was involved in youth ministry, and I was predominantly mentoring girls similar age to me who were in the foster care system. So a really eye-opening experience, and I did that all the way until I left to go on my first overseas trip. When I left school, I decided to go into nursing, predominantly because it made the most sense. I liked helping people. I didn't mind a bit of blood and gore, so nursing it was. And when I graduated, I went on I think it was a 2-week go trip. Do you remember Transend's go trips? So you could go and basically see what the Transend missos were up to. Funnily enough, the only reason I went is because my friend wanted to go, and she didn't want to go by herself without knowing anyone else. Little did I know that go trip was going to kind of be the U-turn in what I thought I had planned for my life. And I went to Thailand, Bangladesh, Tripura, and Kolkata. So, and it was actually in Kolkata that I had this crazy experience, well, not so crazy, just an experience really of God really speaking to me about, if I'm going to be honest, about my own selfish plans and whether or not I was willing to do what it was that he was calling me to. So I said yes without really knowing what the yes meant, which is probably the best way to say yes, because if I knew, I might not have said yes. And I then went back to New Zealand and started my first job nursing. And after I'd finished my new graduate nursing year, I looked into opportunities to kind of test out this call to overseas mission work, and ended up signing up with SIM to spend 9 months in Ethiopia. That 9 months turned into 18 months. I was originally going to help out, have a look around. I ended up running a rural health clinic for 18 months as the only foreigner in the village. And that again was a really eye-opening experience, because I went in thinking, I'm a nurse, and I was young, I was 22, naive, thought I could save the world, and quickly realised I had no language, no skills, and I was on my own in a culture that I didn't understand. So I guess that was like my first experience of how working in partnership with another culture can just grow and expand your vision of who God is. And then when I left Ethiopia, I went back to New Zealand, and basically I'm kind of like a let's get it done kind of person. So I went and knocked on the door at Transend and kind of said, what have you guys got? I'm thinking about going back to Ethiopia long term. Is there anything else you guys think, since I was a Baptist? And they said, why don't you go out on a trip and have a look at Kolkata? They're looking for a nurse. And I thought, Kolkata? It's quite noisy, it's It's quite a lot of people. I don't really want to go to Kolkata, but I was already planning a trip back to Ethiopia to look at a potential long-term role there. And so I thought, might as well. You're already flying all the way to Ethiopia. What's a little stop to India on the way? Little did I know that again was going to be another big milestone. And God spoke really clearly to me. I went to India first, and I still didn't like the lots of people. I still didn't like the noise, but God said this was going to be my home, really clearly. And I was sort of a bit nervous because I was then going to Ethiopia, meeting with all of these people to talk about this long-term role that I said that I was going to do. So I kind of just said to the crew in India, I feel like this is it, but let me go to Ethiopia and then I'll let you know. And I turned up in Ethiopia and they said, I'm really, really sorry, but we've actually found a local person to do that role that we were thinking that you might do. And I was like, okay, that's a pretty decent sign from God that India it is. So I again went back to New Zealand, rocked up to the Transient office and said, what do I need to do to get to India long term? They said, you need to do Bible college and then we'll talk. So, and they said I needed to have a minimum of a diploma. So I went, if you guys know where the Transient office is, it's upstairs and Kerry's downstairs. So I went straight downstairs to Kerry and said, what's the fastest way to get a diploma? And enrolled in that course. And then kind of the rest is history. I went to Bangladesh first to learn language. I spent a year in Bangladesh and then moved to India and spent just over 8 years in India working in really similar community to the video on the screen with Pip Rea and looking at holistic care of women in the trade. And then 4.5 years ago now, returned back to New Zealand and kept on my missional work, but this time in a New Zealand context. So I was leading a social service agency predominantly working with youth in Oranga Tamariki care and their parents. And then I moved here to the beautiful Te Tā Tukaro and started in Whangarei working at Arataki. So for me, all of those things are missional, all of those things is what saying yes to God looks like. I won't tell you my initial thoughts about moving to Whangarei. So the scripture for this Renew Together week is Matthew 13, 3-9. And the theme of this one is mutual listening, which I think is cool. And I have to say, as I was writing this and thinking and praying about what I was going to say, I was quite challenged myself, which, for those of that you don't know, whenever you're preaching, it's always a sermon to yourself first before you can say it to anyone else. So Matthew 13, 3-9, it's really, really well-known parable. So then he told them many things in parables, saying, a farmer went out to sow his seed. Some fell along the path, and the birds came and ate it up. Some fell on rocky places where it did not have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. But when the sun came up, the plants were scorched, and they withered because they had no root. Other seed fell amongst thorns, which grew and choked the plants. Still, other seed fell on good soil, where it produced a crop, 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown. Whoever has ears, let them hear. So as I was kind of reading the scripture, this parable, there was 3 components, that sort of come to mind: the sower, the seed, and the ground. So the sower, so Jesus calls the person in the parable the sower, but at that point in time, that wasn't actually like a job that somebody had. That was just a task of many that the farmers or the labourers did. So Jesus is just highlighting to us that his main task and the work that he's going to be known for is sowing, and sowing the seed of the kingdom. So then the second component is the seed. And all of the seed is the same. The quality of the seed in this parable is not in question. And Jesus is calling the seed his kingdom, the word of the kingdom. And the seed is sown generously across all the different kinds of soil. The seed and the sower are the constant, and what is different or what varies is the type of soil that receives the seed. And as I was thinking about the seed, there were two things that stood out to me. One is that there's heaps of waste, right? So there's 4 types of soil, and only one of them produces any seed. Yet the seed is going out onto all of them. So if you think that there's equal amounts of seed going out, that's 3/4 of the seed that's just going to waste. And I was thinking that that's, in some ways, it's a little encouraging, but it's also a little sad, right? It's encouraging that, like, we don't have to be disappointed when we're sharing about this amazing, transformative Jesus that we all know, and people don't respond. But it's also a bit sad in that we know that there's this amazing, transformative message, and people aren't receiving it. And the second thing that kind of stood out to me is that there's really an enormous harvest from the good soil. When the soil is good, when we truly embrace and respond and accept the transforming kingdom message, there will be much fruit in what we're doing and saying. So now onto the soil. This is us. And I think that we all at different times are different types of soil. Or maybe we've got some good soil in us, and then over here there's this little patch of rocky soil or thorny soil. But the first one is the pathway. So if you can imagine a piece of dirt that is a path, people are walking up and down it all day, every day, hundreds of people, it's going to become really hard. It's going to be compacted, and if you chuck seed on there, it's not going to go anywhere. It's just going to sit on the top, and then the birds are going to come along and eat it all up. And as I was kind of thinking about this, I was thinking about people who become cynical or a bit bitter or become really hurt by previous experiences, and they put this outer shell on them. And it stops this transforming message coming through and penetrating into their hearts. And this hard ground, it needs to be tilled, it needs to be softened for the surface to be broken open and the deeper, softer soil to be exposed. Sounds awesome, eh? Wouldn't you like someone to come along and dig up your hard outer shell? No, it doesn't sound very nice at all. And as I was thinking of, that soil, there was a lady that came to mind. I'll call her Selma. She was a lady that I worked with in Kolkata, and when I first met her, I wish I could show you a picture of her. She had this scowl on her face. She had lived a hard life. She was trafficked at the age of 4 and had suffered abuse after abuse after abuse after abuse. I met her when she was 28. So 24 years of abuse, of trauma, of developing this hard shell about how horrific the world had been to her. And when I first met her, like, part of my role was just to build relationship, to chat, to drink tea, to build connections, and then eventually, when people were ready, to give them the opportunity to leave the trade and help facilitate an alternative job or way of life. And I remember when I first met her, she wasn't interested at all. She didn't want to hear, she didn't want to know about it. She barely even was welcome to the cup of tea that I bought her. But as months and months went on, I slowly started to see little cracks in her outer shell. She started to smile on the odd occasion with my great sense of Bengali humour. She occasionally would open up and share a little bit of her story. Fast forward 3 years, and she was ready to make the exit from the trade into work at FreeSet. For me, this was like amazing and a massive celebration. But for her, it was really just the beginning of that slow work of tilling her hard outer shell. But the amazing thing was that God was at work. He was doing it in the time that she could manage, slowly, gently, carefully. By the time I left and returned back to New Zealand, a few more years later, she was speaking devotions at FreeSet. She was worshipping, going to church, and God had transformed her. But it was hard for her. The second type of soil that we're talking about is the rocky ground. So this soil is actually given the most attention in this parable, and it's best described by what's not there. So it's not much earth, because they did not have much deep earth, they didn't have any roots. And I guess this soil was talking about the people who first hear the message of God's amazing transformative love. They're all excited, super enthusiastic, but it kind of fades. And a couple of weeks later, they've moved on. Something else has popped up. So Jesus describes these people with shallow soil. The roots haven't gone deep and they haven't found any moisture. They've not been fed or grown. This, for me, is about discipleship in some ways. It's really great to have the evangelist standing up the front, hyping everybody up, grading that commitment, and then it's the what next. It's the slowly building, growing, deepening of that faith that hasn't happened. And then there is the thorny ground. And if this parable, I guess, is about humble listening, then these people have kind of choked their ability to listen. They have let too many other voices take precedence, or they've lost focus on the distinctive voice of Jesus. It can be really easy to be overtaken by whatever issue or agenda is on top. And it sounds really great. It's not wrong. But sometimes if we're not listening to what it is that God's doing, God's calling us to do, it can become a distraction, and actually what God is calling us to can sometimes drop to last place. And when I was thinking about this thorny ground, I was thinking about when I first arrived in Kolkata. So for me, the journey to get to Kolkata was kind of a long one. I know it doesn't seem that long because it just went bang, bang, bang. But for me, I'm like once I make a decision, let's do it. So I had to do a year at Bible college. Then I had to get accepted to go. Then I had to tour around fundraising. And then when I was finally ready to leave New Zealand, I got sent to another country to learn language for a year. So I remember when I first arrived in Kolkata, I had it sussed. I knew what I was going to do. I knew how I was going to do it. I had spent all of this extra kind of should have been my language study time, like planning and thinking and dreaming about what it is that I was going to do when I arrived in Kolkata. And it was going to start by meeting all of the women one-on-one and doing a physical health assessment and then addressing those things. That's what I was there to do. I was a nurse, I was going to do physical health. And it became pretty clear to me after the first 4, maybe 5 times that I met with women that maybe this wasn't, my plans weren't quite what God was actually wanting me to do. And I was a little bit deflated, one, because I had done all this prep. I had it sorted. I knew what I was going to do. But actually, in the listening to the women and hearing their stories and hearing them talk about what it is that they wanted, I everything kind of changed. And I remember talking with a woman there named Mina. And if any of you have ever visited Kolkata, you'll know, or know Free Set well, you'll know Mina. She's the matriarch of the community. She's been working with supporting women long before Free Set arrived, and probably will continue until the day she dies. And I met with her and I said, Mina, I had these plans and this is what I was thinking, and I was asked to do this, but the women are saying this. And she said to me, I'll never forget it. She doesn't mince her words, Mina. She said, are you here to do what you think, or are you here to do what we need? And I was like, I've been told. But I think it's this real good picture of how sometimes we have these really good ideas and we kind of take off on them, and we never actually stop to check in whether that's what God's calling us to. And if I had done a physical house program, if I went and did what it was that I thought that I was supposed to be doing and didn't stop to listen, it still would have looked good. It would have sounded good. It would have met a need. But actually that stopping and listening ended up creating what became Tamar and is now kind of like the full social community side of what's happening in Kolkata with Joya. And that was beyond my imagination, beyond what I thought was possible. But that's what God's imagination had for that community. And he brought the right people along to be able to facilitate it. And so I think it's really important that we try and chop down the thorns, even if they kind of look a little pretty. Then there's the good soil. So there's nothing complicated about the soil. It isn't special. But the essential thing is that the seed entered the soil and the word was heard for what it is. The life-changing, life-empowering gospel of Jesus, who died and was resurrected. And this dying seed that brings new life took root deep into hearts and into the lifestyles of the soil. The soil that regularly allows seed to be sown will always bear much fruit. The people described as this type of soil did three things. They heard. They really heard. Then they accepted. They received it and they let it go deep into their hearts and souls. And then they produced fruit. They let the seed do what only the seed can do, and that's bear fruit. And I guess if the core message of this parable is to listen with humility, and we become involved missionally with the poor, with the disadvantaged, with the unreached of the world, with those on the margins of society, whether it's here, India, Ethiopia, or anywhere in the world, we have to start with listening. And I guess it's a humbling step for us, because it's saying we don't come with the answers, techniques, or the formula, but we come with open hearts, listening ears, knowing that God is already at work in people's lives and that each person has much to give and teach us. And right now, I still get to be a little bit involved in Kolkata. So I am helping Loyal, who was featured in the video, with their transition plan. And I have to say that it has been the most humbling, heart-filling experience. So for those of you that don't know, Sarah and Paul Beasley founded the Loyal Workshop a number of years ago. And they have made the decision to return permanently to New Zealand. They're in New Zealand now. And as part of that decision-making process, they really wanted to hand over the ownership and the leadership of Loyal to the locals. And so they have put together this succession planning team who are looking at a 3-year transition of Paul and Sarah stepping away and ownership being transferred locally, and local leaders taking full responsibility. And I am privileged enough to sit there as the only non-loyal person and provide advice. It's really interesting. It's on a Friday night, and because of the time difference, it starts at 7 p.m. and we go all the way through to 11 p.m. And it's all in Bengali, and I haven't been in India for 4 years. So, and we're not talking light Bengali, we're talking succession planning Bengali. So it hurts my head sometimes, but I think one of the things that I have really noticed is the beauty that comes from that humble listening. So I have watched, as Sarah, at the first meeting we had, everybody was in Kolkata except for me. And now, a few meetings on, Sarah and Paul are back in New Zealand. They're working about 2 days each for Loyal, and then they've got part-time jobs here in New Zealand doing other things. And I've watched as they have slowly stepped back and in some cases pushed, in some cases lightly nudged their local leaders forward. And it's the most beautiful thing to watch that transition take place, to see women who used to work in the trade now contributing to leadership of the business that changed their life, that are holding up the beautiful values and message of God's kingdom, that they want to figure out how they can make sure that that core of what Loyal's about stays. And it's just the most beautiful thing. We're only 9 months into the 3-year transition plan, and already you can see what God is doing and how he brought the right people back like 5 years ago, 6 years ago, into this place, and how he has grown and shaped them. And they are good soil, and they are bearing much fruit. In the middle of COVID, there was no foreigners at Loyal. They were all back in New Zealand. Paul and Sarah had been here and then got stuck here, and Joel and Lizzie were expecting their first baby and made the decision to be in New Zealand for the birth of their baby. And the Loyal community took it upon themselves to serve their community in the middle of the pandemic. They pulled from their wages, they bought food supplies, and they distributed it into the red light community where the money had suddenly disappeared and women were going without meals. And when you talk to them about their decision to do that, they didn't run it past Paul and Sarah. They just said, "This is our family, and we want to show them God's love." And I just think it's so amazing. And it takes humility as the foreigner who gets sent to step back and say, actually, I'm not needed. It takes humility and humble listening from Joel and Lizzie as like the logical next leaders, giving their young and their foreign, to say, no, not us, them. It's simple things that really make a difference. So, like for example, nobody has the key to the Loyal workshop except for the general manager, Kunal. So Joel, Lizzie, no, none of the foreigners, Kunal is the general manager. And it's these small kind of things that show God's kingdom and what God is doing and the beautiful transforming work that he is doing through all of the people that he is in relationship. So I guess for me, I'm kind of, I want to follow Jesus's example by seeking mutual humility and that cross-shaped living in service of others. I'm not always good at it. Jesus describes the word as a seed, and we all know that for a seed to bring new life, it must fall into the ground, break open, and let life come. This is exactly what Jesus does with his own life, and when we press into the value of mutual humility, we've been called to die to our pride and to die to control. And I know for me, my experience in India in particular did break me in many ways. It challenged me. I wanted to control things. I wanted things to work out. I wanted to rescue, to fix. That's why I went into the helping profession. But I guess what India taught me is that God is at work doing all things, renewing all things. And he is calling each one of us to participate in what he's already doing. He wasn't calling me to fix the community that I was a part of in India. He was calling me to join with him in what he was doing and play my part. And I think when I look back about my time in India, it was the hardest but most rewarding, most spiritually growing community and time that I've ever had. So, what kind of soil am I? What kind of soil are you? I have to say, when I was prepping this and I read verse 8, I was a little bit challenged. Verse 8 says, "Still other seed fell on good soil where it produced a crop 100, 60, or 30 times what was sown." Does my life reflect a crop that is 160 or 30 times what was sown? I don't know. If not, what's getting in the way? Have we kind of started off as good soil, but we've become a bit cynical or a bit tired, or we've been hurt in what we've given out? We've been hurt by other people that are supposed to be reflecting God's love. I guess if that's us, then maybe it's time to allow God to till up that hard soil, to crack that outer shell of our cynicism or our hurt and allow God to bring healing and restoration. If the pathway becomes hard, then it's much more difficult for God's radical transformational message to penetrate. Or has life just got really busy and the soil has been overtaken by thorns? Have we got busy doing the doing and forgotten to listen to what God's calling us to? I definitely catch myself in that boat. I actually was a little bit challenged when I was writing that part as well. You can get caught up being busy doing good, and actually, before you know it, your life is a bunch of thorns that are distracting from what God's actually trying to do through you. So God's calling us to all be good soil, to be open and listening to what he's saying to us, what he's calling us to, and what he's doing in the world, in our community. And we each have a part to play. We each have to remember to continually look at what our crop of soil looks like. There might be a little thorny patch over there that's starting to develop and it needs some weeding. There might be a few rocks over there or a few patches that have been worn down and hardened. But I guess the invitation that Transcend are calling us to with this series of Renew Together is to reflect on our own soil, to be good soil, to be listening to what God is saying to us, to be watching what God is doing in the world and figuring out what our part is in making his kingdom come. I'm just going to close with a prayer. Father, I just thank you that you are a God who is at work in each of our lives. I pray that you would give us the humility to look inside, to see how we're doing, to see the areas where we might need to pull some weeds out, the areas that we might need to break our shell and soften. I pray that you would give us the courage to listen to what you are calling us to do, and the boldness to step forward and do it. We thank you that you are bringing your kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven. And I pray that as you use us to bring your kingdom purposes, that we would know more of who you are and be transformed more and more by your love, grace, and hope. Amen.